There are monuments and structures named and dedicated to some of the most beloved people in the history of the world. But what if I told you some of them had some crazy skeletons in their closet? It seems no matter how much good you do, sometimes it's outshadowed by the bad. So let's start off with a man whose outshadowing was really shadowy. Thomas Jefferson is a name that you definitely know, a face that you definitely recognize, and you might not know this, but he was the third president of the United States. He was the founding father who was most instrumental in drafting the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, was drafted on July 2nd. It just wasn't signed by everybody until July 4th. He was a diplomat, he was a lawyer, he was a real smart guy, and one of the guys that was instrumental in founding the United States of America. He was also a slave owner. Like, not a little bit of a slave owner. This dude had 600 slaves. Yes, this is the same guy who wrote, and I quote, "All men are created equal." I mean, as long as they're white. This guy had a ton of slaves. He had a plantation. He profited dearly off of the labor of these slaves, which of course were free, minus lodging and housing, and you guys know how slavery works. And he never ever freed them, including the ones that he was sleeping with, made out of his own DNA, by the way, and after he died, none of them were freed in his will. The conditions on his plantation were grueling. He was not a nice guy to the slaves that he had. This is a known fact. He was very harsh on them, so even the fact that you're a slave to begin with is not great, but if you're one of Thomas Jefferson's, even worse. Jefferson had a long-term relationship with Sally Hemings, who was an enslaved woman at his plantation, who was his late wife's half-sister. Okay, so they did have children, and they were enslaved, but he did, in fact, free them, eventually. But let's not get away from it here. Thomas Jefferson kept his own children as slaves. Now, Jefferson was aware that emancipation was eventually going to happen, but he thought that all black people, all slaves at this time in the US, were of inferior quality and intelligence to the white man, the founders, the people who belonged in America. And he believed and wrote many times that upon emancipation, all slaves should be returned back to Africa. Hey, thanks for coming and working for free and being whipped and all sorts of other really terrible things, but now you have to go back because you're free. Kind of like, this guy's wild. He was also a big fan of expanding the US, and he used slaves to do it. So he understood that these people were instrumental and they really couldn't do what they were doing without them. Now, his racism wasn't reserved just from African Americans or Africans at the time that were brought over. He also didn't like Native people, and he thought that the expansion westward, it was totally okay to relocate these people or just steal their land, steal their possessions, or sometimes steal their women. That was totally fine. Again, remember, everyone who's not white was inferior. Unless, of course, they assimilated into white culture. If they wanted to keep their own culture, they're also disgusting, and there's no need for them to be here. Thomas Jefferson, not a really good guy. The next not really good guy was Steve Jobs. Now, this is a guy you probably know, the co-founder of Apple and several other things. The guy with one shirt that he wore just basically everywhere all the time, a black turtleneck. And although he has passed on now, his legacy is still here. You might be watching this very episode on your Apple device. He was known more or less to be a slave driver. Of course, this isn't true slavery because he did pay the workers at his Chinese factories a few pennies an hour or however it worked out to be. But either way, even the employees in America who were to get a wage that is livable, he was very rude, very demeaning to a lot of them, oftentimes screaming at members of his staff in front of others, putting them down and making them feel humiliated.
Wow, the Apple Store. You know, Steve Jobs was a psychotic, but if screaming at everybody built this, I applaud him.
Now you might be thinking, well, my boss does this too. Okay, that's great, but this is Steve Jobs. Like, at the time, he was one of the most influential people on the entire planet. He had an image to uphold, and he just didn't care. He also liked to take the ideas of other people and give himself the credit. This guy was a clear narcissistic personality type, and he wouldn't even give a little bit of the credit to the people who made him millions and eventually billions of dollars. Not saying that anyone could have done it without him. He was instrumental. He was a genius. But at the same time, give credit where credit is due. Be a decent human being. Speaking of decency, he also denied paternity of his daughter. Even though there was a paternity test, that said, no, she's definitely yours, he still denied paternity for a very long time. Eventually, once the raising of this child was done and she was a little bit older, he accepted paternity and claimed her as his own. And yes, all those things about people unaliving themselves at the factories in China and the preventative measures, a lot of those things were actually true. Imagine living and working in an environment where there is really no regulation, there is no standards for living, to the point where you want to end it all because of the working conditions. Steve Jobs was the CEO of the company. As the boss, everything comes down to you. He could have prevented that, and he didn't. Also, he completely screwed Steve Wozniak, who was the other co-founder of Apple, out of millions or maybe even billions of dollars. This is a guy who had all the help in the world from someone he needed it from and still just destroyed this guy financially, oftentimes giving him pennies on the dollar when he deserved his fair share. A name you might not recognize, Allen Dulles, but if you do recognize the name, you already know and are very strongly opinionated on what I'm about to say, I'm sure. Let me know in the comments section below if you know who this guy is. Dulles was a director of the CIA. He was in charge of the CIA in the 50s and early 60s, or for 2 years in the 60s. His brother John Foster Dulles served as Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles graduated from Princeton University and then later attended George Washington University of Law School. He served in World War I as a diplomat, and in 1953, Dulles was appointed director of the CIA by President then Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dulles had a hit and miss reputation with the presidents that he served under. Keep in mind, the director of the CIA has a relationship with the US Commander-in-Chief unlike any other. And there were several things he did right, but then there was the Bay of Pigs. And not to get right into it, but more or less this was a planned invasion on the Fidel Castro-led Cuba at the time, and it was a miserable failure. Now keep in mind, at the time, it was JFK who was the president, and JFK and Dulles didn't always see eye to eye. Sometimes, in some reports, they kind of had this clashing of heads. JFK fired Dulles after the Bay of Pigs incident, and this was an embarrassment to Dulles. Can you imagine, you were the director, you're the first civilian director of the CIA, and now all of a sudden, one mistake, or perceivably one mistake, and then you're gone. Very shortly after that, JFK is assassinated in Dallas. You can watch this video right here. We talk more about that and other assassinations of presidents. There was a commission, the Warren Commission, who looked after the investigation of the assassination of JFK. And who was one of the most instrumental people in the investigation of that assassination? Allen Dulles. John McCone took over for Allen Dulles, but they were in cahoots, and even to this day, the FBI admits there's a lot of information about that assassination that was never released and is still classified, and at the time of the investigation was being withheld. Allen Dulles probably went to his grave knowing exactly why and who killed JFK, and maybe not why, but had information of who put that guy in charge of killing JFK in the first place. Oftentimes, if there is a poll for the most celebrated president of the United States, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, is always at the very top of that list. One of the most charismatic guys on the face of the earth. And just like JFK, he had an assassination attempt, except for his didn't actually work. However, this was the time of World War II, and he was praised for his handling of most things World War II. However, in 1942, he was instrumental in taking everything from Japanese people and putting them in internment camps, which is pretty disgusting. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which led to the forced relocation and internment of about 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were US citizens. They were held in these internment camps under harsh conditions, and they lost their homes, businesses, and property. So imagine, because you're the wrong color, even though you're born in the country, all of your things can be taken away from you. You can be taken away from your family, sometimes having your children stripped from you, and forced into what is basically a labor camp. And although perhaps open borders aren't a good idea, when there's an atrocity happening like the Holocaust, perhaps we should let some refugees in the legal way. But in 1939, the SS St. Louis, carrying over 900 Jewish refugees, were turned away from the US, forced to return to Europe, and then a lot of those passengers perished in the Holocaust. FDR also liked to use federal agencies, including the FBI, to monitor and intimidate political opponents and critics. This includes surveillance of civil rights leaders and his opposition. I'm not saying this doesn't happen anymore, but that's a pretty immoral thing to do. Let me know in the comment section below who's the most beloved character in history that you think deserves to be on this list if we do a part 3. I do videos every weekend, so I'll see you in the next one. Please hit subscribe. Appreciate it.